Listen now, not with ears, but with the stillness behind them. Let your breath soften and drift gently into the misted hills where time no longer tugs and the world lies hushed in prayer. In a forgotten cradle of hills where the dawn sighed through blue-grey fog like a whispered hymn, there stood a monastery of old stone and cedar beam. It was neither grand nor poor, but cloaked in the grace of quiet purpose. Walls softened with ivy, windows framed in deep-set arches, and a chapel bell that sang not to summon, but to soothe. Here, in the hush between vespers and nightfall, a single candle flickered on a desk of oak. A solitary figure sat before it, hunched in the patient bend of labor, robed in wool, dyed with walnut ink. His hands moved slowly and precisely, guiding the silver tip of a rare quill, one dipped not in ink alone, but in silence, memory, and sacred care. Brother Anselm, the scribe of the Silver Quill. He was neither young nor old. His hair, a colour between smoke and stone, hung just to the collar of his robe. His fingers were long, knuckled, and stained faintly with pigment. Lapis blue, saffron yellow, crushed malachite. He smelled faintly of beeswax and ink, of old vellum and lavender oil used to keep the moths away from ancient bindings. Each night, as the monastery slept under the hush of God's breath, Anselm wrote. But it was not merely writing, no. What flowed from the tip of his quill was more than words. It was devotion cast in silver. It was knowledge, soothed into permanence. He wrote not for eyes, but for souls. His was a vocation of the eternal. The quill, yes, the Silver Quill. It had been gifted long ago, passed down from master to apprentice, always entrusted to those who understood that the written word was not a tool, but a torch. The shaft had once belonged to a falcon's feather, dipped in molten silver, cooled in holy water, and polished until it gleamed like moonlight. It sang, not in music, but in the scratch-scratch whisper upon parchment that only monks like Anselm could truly hear. And tonight, as the fog curled lovingly at the stained-glass windows and the world held its breath, Brother Anselm dipped the quill once more and wrote, "In the beginning, the Word was with the light, and the light did not tremble." The letters flowed with elegance, each one shaped with care. The parchment was soft calfskin, cured over weeks and scraped thin with obsidian blades. Every page was a sacrament. Beside him, small bowls of colour shimmered faintly. Crushed lapis lazuli from distant lands, vermilion made from powdered cinnabar, gold leaf so thin it trembled at the breath of passing air. He did not hurry. He did not tire. With each letter, his breathing deepened, becoming slower, aligned with the rhythm of his craft. To write was to pray. To paint was to serve. The illuminated page was not for beauty alone. It was a mirror of the divine. Behind him, the ancient stones of the Scriptorium held centuries of quiet secrets. Time itself seemed to rest here. Even the wind that wound through the monastery moved gently, like a mother with a sleeping child. The other monks had long retired. In their cloisters, they dreamed of saints and psalms. But Anselm belonged to the silence that lived after the last candle had been snuffed. He had always been this way. Even as a novice, he had walked the halls like a ghost, finding corners of stillness where the breath of God seemed closest. While others debated theology, Anselm had listened. To the turning of pages, to the crackle of drying ink, to the way the light changed as it fell through coloured glass. He had not sought the Silver Quill, it had found him. That was the way of such things. The candle flame trembled softly as Brother Anselm leaned forward, bringing his breath close enough to stir its halo but not extinguish its light. On the parchment before him, the ink shimmered faintly, not yet dry, thick with iron gall, soot, and a touch of something alchemical. He reached for a small walnut shell bowl to his left. Within it, a dark liquid slept, its surface oily and iridescent under candlelight. The ink was his own mixture, concocted not by recipe alone, but by devotion. It was made from crushed oak galls gathered during the solstice, rainwater collected under a full moon, soot from the chapel's incense burners, and a whisper of wine. Blessed, not drunk. He stirred it with a sliver of holly wood, murmuring a Latin phrase, lux per scripturam, anima per verbum. Light through writing, soul through word. The ink rippled in response, dark and secretive. Each component of the scriptorium had a spirit, a story. The pigments had been traded over mountains and deserts by sun-scorched pilgrims. The gold leaf had come from a single bar, gifted by a nobleman who'd once lost his wife to illness and sought to preserve her psalms forever in a book of light. Anselm, unlike the friars who toiled in the fields or debated faith in the refectory, communed with these silent elements. His world was the breath between strokes, the hush between prayers, the glimmer of gold beneath a brusher's whisper. Tonight, he worked on the Codex Viridi, the Green Codex. A bestiary of sorts, mingled with scripture, that told of divine truths through nature's forms. Each page took months, sometimes more, to perfect. The page before him now held the profile of a lion, outlined in gold leaf, filled with brushwork so fine it could make one weep. But it was the eyes Anselm hadn't yet rendered. He paused. Eyes were never rushed. To illuminate eyes was to paint the soul. A lion might roar with majesty or burn with wrath. It depended on the stroke. One misplaced line and the page would weep ink forever. Anselm set the quill down and instead reached for a brush made from squirrel hair, bound in swan feather. With reverence, he dipped it into a shallow dish of azurite, the blue of deep skies and distant dreams. He steadied his hand with the care of one touching relics, one gentle sweep, then another, and there. Beneath gold, above scripture, the lion's gaze was born, wise, watchful, eternal. He leaned back, breathing in the silence as one might a forest after rain. The page glowed beneath the candlelight, no longer mere pigment, but a thing become, a fusion of vision and faith, of earth and eternity. Somewhere above the scriptorium, the bells sang the hour. 3 chimes. Matins would begin soon, the nocturnal vigil, a time when the monastery stirred once more with whispered prayers and soft footfalls. But Anselm did not rise. His prayers were here, nestled between vellum and candle wax, nestled between pigment bowls and his own heartbeats. He reached for the next folio, a blank page stretched like untouched snow. There was a peace in its emptiness, a promise, a request. He laid it gently upon the desk, brushing off invisible dust with a cloth embroidered in silver thread. This cloth had belonged to his master, Brother Odric, long since returned to dust and memory. Anselm could still hear the old man's voice, even now. A voice as soft as snowfall. Do not write to impress, write to remain. Let every curve of your letters kneel in humility. He took up the silver quill once more and began. The heart in the glade knows not the hunter, only the hush of leaves. So too does the soul, untroubled by judgment, turn toward the light in stillness. His hand moved like flowing water. Every capital letter he adorned with filigree. Every border he planned with the eye of a gardener, placing leaves and vines in curving harmony. Occasionally, he would sketch a moth in flight, or a tiny acorn at the base of a verse. Reminders that even the small bore witness to God. And then, without turning his head, he felt it. A presence. Not footsteps, not voice, just the air shifting slightly, as though someone watched him through the long veil of silence. But Anselm did not flinch. He only spoke as one would to the wind. "Brother Thomas, you rise early?" From the shadowed doorway emerged a younger man, robed in the same walnut-dyed wool, though his hood was pushed back. His hair was russet, his face gentle, but still marked with the impatience of youth. "I couldn't sleep," the young monk said, approaching the scriptorium desk. "The bells seemed louder tonight, or perhaps I've grown more restless." Anselm smiled softly, his quill pausing in mid-curve. "You've grown more aware." Brother Thomas studied the desk, the glimmering pigments, the parchment, the slowly forming words. His eyes widened slightly in awe. "You never sleep during the night watch," he said. "Do you dream while awake?" Anselm looked down at the page, tracing one golden vine with the tip of his finger. "No," he said. "I remember." Thomas blinked. "Remember what?" Anselm reached for a glass vial of green earth pigment and uncorked it slowly. "That which others forget. That knowledge is fragile. That beauty fades if not bound in care. That souls, like stories, must be written if they are to endure." Thomas was quiet for a long while. Then, "One master, one apprentice, one silver quill, one flame. Two hearts bound by ink, by silence, by the sacred alchemy of faith turned into form." Outside, the world shifted softly toward dawn. But within the stone womb of the monastery, eternity had already begun. The parchment glowed faintly as Brother Thomas sat across from Anselm, his brow furrowed in concentration, the breath in his chest shallow and deliberate. He did not yet write, he only observed. The candlelight carved amber shadows along his cheeks, while the silence between master and pupil deepened into something sacred. It was not the silence of nothing, but of presence, of reverence, of time held gently in cupped hands. Brother Anselm dipped his silver quill once more and continued his line, not hurried, not slow. His movement was patient as ivy, certain as rainfall. Thomas watched each letter form, each flourish curl, as though the quill itself whispered to the vellum. When the stroke was complete, Anselm laid the quill down, not as one abandons a tool, but as one bows from prayer. Without lifting his gaze, he spoke. "There are stories within stories," he said, "and the quill knows them all." Thomas tilted his head. "The silver quill?" Anselm nodded, fingertips gently brushing its shaft. "It was never meant for beauty. Not at first. It was born of ruin." A pause, and then, "Would you like to know its true origin?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "And so," Anselm began, "it was many years ago, long before I took these vows, before my hair was grey, before I knew silence as a friend." Anselm reached for a cloth and began gently wiping the base of the ink bottle. "I was an apprentice in a great abbey further south, near the valley of Thessar. That abbey, it was known as the guardian of tomes. Thousands of volumes, scriptures, herbals, histories. The air smelled always of dust and crushed sage. There were monks who spent their entire lives cataloguing a single shelf." He smiled faintly, eyes lost in the gold leaf glimmering from the page. "But one winter," he said, "a fire swept through the valley. A band of mercenaries, exiled knights turned desperate, descended on the abbey under cover of snow. They believed we were hiding silver or secrets or both." Thomas leaned forward, breath held. We had neither, Anselm said, but they didn't believe us. So they set fire to the Scriptoria, the shelves, the archives, even the reliquary where our oldest scrolls lay. I remember the flames catching the edges of a book on medicine, illustrations of liverwort curling into ash. His voice remained soft but steady, like pages turning in a windless room. While others fled, my master brother Odric carried only one thing, a narrow case of cedarwood wrapped in wool. He handed it to me with trembling fingers and said, "Guard this, not for its worth, but for its witness." Anselm turned, finally meeting Thomas's gaze. It was the Silver Quill. Thomas sat in silence, unsure whether to speak or to bow his head. Anselm continued, "When the abbey fell, we wandered north. Odric was old by then. He could not walk far. In a cave, outside the village of Austercliff, I watched him die. Not with fear, but peace. He gave me the quill with his last breath and said," Anselm's voice grew even quieter, "Write what is lost. Illuminate what others forget." A long silence followed. Then the candle flickered slightly, as if nodding in grief. Thomas looked to the quill resting on the desk, its silver sheen muted now in the soft glow. Not a trophy, not a relic, a witness, a survivor. "Have you ever thought of leaving it behind?" Thomas asked, voice barely above a breath. Anselm smiled, not with his lips, but with the corners of his eyes. "You do not leave behind your own breath," he said. "This quill carries not just ink, but remembrance. With every letter, it steadies the world." He looked again to the parchment before him. "And one day," he added, "I will pass it to someone else, when they are ready, when they understand that writing is not merely making marks, but making meaning." Thomas lowered his eyes to the blank sheet in front of him. The vellum seemed somehow heavier now, not from weight, but from expectation, from legacy. He reached for the plain quill, the beginner's feather, and dipped it into ink with trembling fingers. "What should I write?" he asked. Anselm didn't answer immediately. He stood instead, stepping over to a nearby shelf. From it, he pulled an older manuscript, worn along the edges, the cover lined with embossed copper leaf. He laid it gently beside Thomas. "Copy this first passage," he said. "Let the words guide your breath. Let your hand serve the sentence, not the other way round." Thomas opened the book and read, "In silence, the soul listens. In listening, it learns. In learning, it remembers what was never taught, but always known." He nodded, inhaled deeply, and began. Anselm returned to his side of the desk, the silver quill once more between his fingers, but he did not write right away. Instead, he watched the young monk work. Each motion was unsteady, the lines uneven, but there was care, intent, and that, Anselm knew, was the beginning of all things worth preserving. In the rafters above, the pigeons shuffled softly, their feathers brushing against stone. Outside, the fog began to lift, just enough for the faintest morning light to color the monastery's stained glass windows with muted rose and blue. The monastery stirred with slow breath. Bells not yet rung, footsteps not yet echoed, but in the scriptorium, a silent inheritance was already unfolding. Soft now, still. Let your thoughts fold into the hush of dawn. Let your breath flow like ink, gentle and slow. The candle still burns, and the silver quill moves once more. Brother Anselm awoke the next day not from sound, but from the light. A pale shaft of morning sun that streamed through the tall lancet window and rested against his cheek like a silent benediction. A silent meeting with the sound of crying babes silent begetting, soothing beargy, fever blood, silent begedy, the warmth of it, diffused by coloured glass, spread in soft hues, rose, celadon and pale gold, painting the stone floor like a living manuscript. The monastery was waking. Bells would soon toll for prime, yet Anselm lingered in stillness. The linen sheets beneath him were cool. A faint scent of lavender hung in the air, from the sachet he placed in the wall niche each spring, and outside, pigeons rustled feathers, their morning songs slow and guttural, like monks still drowsy from dreams. He sat up, pulled on his robe and quietly stepped from his cell into the long stone corridor. The hallways of the monastery held the breath of centuries. Their walls had witnessed plague and pilgrimage, joy and famine, and still they stood, patient, undemanding. Some monks passed these walls daily without seeing them, but not Anselm. To him, every nick in the stone, every patch of moss, every faded fresco was a word in a sentence too vast to be finished in one lifetime. By the time he reached the scriptorium, the morning mist had begun its retreat. Light now pooled softly on the wooden floor, warming the dust that danced lazily through the air. Thomas was already there, seated at his station. The young monk looked up. "Brother," he said, eyes alert. "I couldn't sleep again. I came to finish the second page." Anselm gave a slight nod. "Then you are learning?" he said. "For the words will not let you rest until they are heard." He walked to his desk, and there it waited, the page he'd begun the night before. The lion with wise eyes, the curling vines, the letters like silver threads in a tapestry of thought. Today would not be about writing. Today was for light. He turned toward the pigment cabinet. A heavy walnut armoire with iron hinges and a velvet lining to keep the dust at bay. Its shelves were filled with small glass jars and stone bowls, each labelled in his own hand: lapis lazuli, malachite, orpiment, vermilion, azurite, shell gold. Anselm opened the cabinet and paused. He placed his hand gently on a shallow stone bowl filled with a substance so blue it seemed to hum. The powdered lapis lazuli shimmered like crushed sky. Few in the world knew how costly it was. Fewer still knew how it was made. He brought the bowl to the desk and beckoned Thomas. "Today," he said softly, "we illuminate." Thomas rose, standing beside him. Anselm gestured to the parchment. "What do you see?" he asked. Thomas leaned closer. "A page," he said slowly. "A lion, words, borders of leaves and curls." Anselm smiled faintly. "You see what it is. But do you know why it is?" Thomas hesitated. "To honor scripture," he guessed. "Yes," Anselm said. "But also to hold light." He reached for a small glass dish filled with honey-colored gum arabic and stirred it with a wooden stick. "When the world falls into chaos, when men forget and fire takes what was once sacred, these pages will remain, but not merely because of ink or parchment." He dipped a fine brush into water and touched it to the powdered blue. A burst of life. The lapis glowed. Color commands the eye. Gold commands awe. When we illuminate, we don't just preserve, we compel. We say, this is worth seeing, this is worth remembering. He dabbed the brush gently onto the parchment, adding a curve of blue beneath the lion's eye. Tiny, deliberate. "Lapis comes from mines beyond the deserts," he said. "It is drawn from stone with sweat and danger. Men have died for this blue." Thomas's eyes widened. "Is that holy?" he asked. Anselm looked up. "Anything that reminds us of beauty and sacrifice is holy." Throughout the morning, Anselm guided him through the process. They mixed orpiment, a brilliant yellow from powdered arsenic sulfide, carefully ground with oil and wine until it gleamed like sunlit gold. Vermilion, was blended from cinnabar, its scarlet hue vibrant and almost too alive for the page. Malachite made green so rich it seemed to breathe. Anselm used a hair-thin brush to paint the tiniest leaf, only visible when tilted toward the light. Thomas watched as he added insects hidden among the vines. Beetles, moths, a spider hanging from a single silver thread. "Why insects?" Thomas asked, his head tilting in curiosity. "Because they're real," Anselm whispered. "Because saints do not walk alone. Even the smallest creature lives within the word. Even a moth, in the margin, has purpose." He opened another book to show Thomas an older illumination. In the border, beside a psalm, a cat chased a mouse. "Is that scripture?" Thomas chuckled. "It is now," Anselm said with a rare smile. "That cat is older than any man alive." They both laughed, quietly, as monks do. Laughter in a monastery is like wind in a chapel. Uninvited, but welcomed by the soul. By midday, the windows were washed in amber. The pigments were dry. The lion now shimmered, not merely with blue and gold, but with presence. The page had changed. It had been transformed. Thomas looked at it with reverence. "Will I ever make something like that?" he asked. Anselm rinsed his brush, wiped it with a cloth, and turned toward him. "You will not make this," he said, "but you will make what only you can. That is all that matters. The lion will be an inspiration." He gently returned the bowl of lapis to the cabinet. "The gemstones sing," he said, "but only when guided by a quiet hand. And as the bells tolled sext, the noonday prayer, the two scribes bowed their heads. In their silence, the light sang back. The stone steps curled downward like a spiral shell, each one hollowed in its center from centuries of careful feet. Brother Anselm moved slowly, his hand trailing the cool wall as he descended into the crypt beneath the monastery. The lantern in his grasp was small, its flame quiet, just enough to paint golden outlines on the walls as he passed. The air was cool here, still and dry, the scent of old earth mingled with wax and the faintest trace of myrrh. Above, the world bustled gently with monastic routine, bells, chants, garden shears clipping lavender. But below, in this quiet spiral, time dissolved into silence. He had not descended into the crypt in some months. Only when the moment was right did he come. The crypt opened into a rounded chamber of vaulted stone. Niches lined the walls, each one housing a modest reliquary or engraved plaque. Some bore names, others only symbols, some nothing at all. The monks buried here had written no fame for themselves. Their books were unsigned, their pages carried no pride. And yet, their hands had copied sacred wisdom, adorned gospels with color, and steadied the trembling candle of knowledge through dark centuries. Anselm knelt before one such niche and placed the lantern beside him. The plaque was smooth and simple, weathered by breath more than touch. Anselm swallowed hard, and weathered by breath more than touch. Only two words had survived time's slow abrasion: Frater Lucianus, Brother Lucian. Anselm folded his hands. He was the first here to hold the quill, he whispered aloud, more to the shadows than himself. The one who taught by doing, not speaking, the one whose illuminations were smaller than a fingernail, but held the whole of heaven inside them. He closed his eyes. He could see the old man's thin frame, bent not by age but by reverence. He had taught Anselm when he first came to the monastery as a postulant, years before the abbey in the south, before the fire, before the vow of silence that Anselm would one day choose to take voluntarily for 3 years. Lucian's hands had shaken constantly, except when writing. Anselm remembered the day Lucian pressed the Silver Quill into his hands for the first time. Not as a gift, not yet, but as a weight. "If your breath does not slow when you hold it," he had said, "you are not yet ready to write." A soft scuffle broke the moment. Brother Thomas stood in the stairway's mouth, holding a candle. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to follow, I just—" Anselm motioned him forward. "You may," he said softly. Thomas stepped inside, eyes widening as he looked upon the walls, the alcoves, the echo of centuries. His gaze caught the one Anselm knelt before. "Is this your master?" he asked. "One of them," Anselm replied. "We are all apprentices, always." Thomas's eyes moved slowly over the inscriptions. So many names, and some with none. "Not all names last," Anselm said, "but the light of their labor does. Their pages still breathe upstairs in our library. Their vines still curl in margins. Their lines of verse still guide the weary. That is their immortality." Thomas crouched beside him. "Will we be here one day?" Anselm placed a hand over his heart, then Thomas's. "Perhaps. Or perhaps we will only be known by what we left on the page. It is enough." The lantern flickered. Anselm stood, slowly, reverently, and gestured toward a small stone altar at the center of the chamber. Upon it sat a book, covered in dust but untouched by mold, its leather strap fastened tightly. He undid the clasp with care. Inside were unbound pages, carefully preserved, unfinished folios, fragments of illuminations, prayers started and never completed. Each one bore the unmistakable mark of the Silver Quill. "This," Anselm said, "is the work of the forgotten. The quill does not always serve the perfect. Sometimes it serves the penitent, the broken, the ones who never finish but begin again and again." He turned one page gently. A single line of script lay across the top. "Lord, my hand is tired, but my will is steady." Thomas stared, lips parted slightly. "Who wrote that?" he asked. Anselm smiled. "No one knows, and that is its holiness." They remained a while longer, leafing through the fragments, the soft rustle of parchment echoing as though the walls themselves listened. When they returned above ground, the wind had picked up slightly. The courtyard trees whispered together. Clouds moved like breath across the sky. Thomas walked more slowly now, his steps measured. In his eyes was the deepening glint of one who no longer sees only stone, but what is written into the stone. As they entered the scriptorium once more, Anselm returned to his desk, but did not sit. Instead, he took the Silver Quill from its rest and lifted it in both hands. Thomas froze. The elder monk examined the feather, ran his thumb once along its shaft, then handed it forward. Thomas did not take it. "Master!" "Not to keep," Anselm said gently, "but to carry. For a while." He held it out. Thomas slowly extended his hands. The Silver Quill rested in his palms like a sleeping bird. "I will show you how to sharpen it," Anselm said. "But only you can learn when it is time to use it." Thomas stared down, his breath growing slower. Then nodded. The bells rang for vespers. Outside, the sun slipped behind the hills. But in the scriptorium, the light had not faded. It had only changed hands. The Silver Quill sat in Thomas's hand, heavier than he expected, not in weight, but in presence. Its shaft was cool and smooth, its feather etched faintly with tiny grooves, signs of careful use, not decay. At its tip, the metal gleamed, fine and sharp, catching the morning light like a sliver of moon. He did not yet move. Anselm stood at his side, silent, letting the moment settle like dust upon a windowsill. At last the elder monk spoke. Place it down. Thomas obeyed, gently setting the quill across a folded cloth. Now, Anselm said, watch. He reached for a thin whetstone, dark and polished by decades of hands. Taking the quill, he brought the nib carefully to the stone's surface, tilting it at a precise angle. The silver must be honed regularly, he murmured, not like iron, not with speed, but with rhythm. And then he began to sharpen, soft, slow movements, a breath, and then the sound, a silky rasp, like silk drawn through sand, the sound of the silver being reawakened. Thomas watched, transfixed. The motion was hypnotic, almost holy. Anselm's hands moved in a practiced arc, as if the sharpening was part of a longer prayer. When the nib dulls, he said, the line grows uncertain. The word loses its spine, the page loses its courage. He paused, examined the point, and nodded. Now it is ready. He handed it back. Thomas held it again. Somehow, it felt different, sharper, alive. The parchment before him was fresh, stretched, and smoothed over a wooden bowl. The ink sat beside it in its small stone bowl, the surface dark as midnight. Anselm watched quietly. You may begin. Thomas hesitated, then dipped the quill into the ink. He hovered over the page and did not move. The point trembled, a single drop forming at its tip. His chest tightened. What if I ruin it? He asked, his voice barely above the whisper of the candle flame. Anselm spoke gently. You will. Thomas looked up, startled. The older monk gave a soft smile. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually you will make mistakes, you will blot the margin, you will miswrite a name, you will tear parchment, perhaps worse. He stepped closer. But that is not the danger. What is? Thomas asked. Anselm leaned in, voice low, refusing to begin. Thomas looked down again. The ink still clung to the tip. He touched the page. A line formed, thin, soft, precise. He exhaled. The second line came more smoothly. A loop, then a stem. Slowly the letters emerged, simple, unadorned, but alive. He was writing. With the silver quill, Anselm turned away, returning to his desk. He did not hover. This was not a time for correction. It was a time for courage. He reached for one of his older manuscripts, letting his fingers brush over the binding. Then opened it to a page deep inside, one marked not by brilliance, but by imperfection. A splotch of ink in the lower margin. A flourish drawn slightly askew. He had made these long ago and kept them, to remind himself. Even the silver quill did not promise perfection. That night, Anselm and Thomas sat by the hearth, sipping warm water steeped with fennel and chamomile. The fire crackled softly, and outside the hills were cloaked again in the silver shawl of fog. Thomas cradled a cloth bundle in his lap, the quill, cleaned and wrapped, resting like a relic. I felt something when I used it, he said. Something strange. Anselm didn't answer at first. He looked into the fire. Then he said quietly, that is because it remembers. Thomas's brow furrowed. The quill? Anselm nodded. It is not magic, but it is memory. Each stroke, each pressure, each prayer ever written with it has left a trace. You felt that. Thomas grew quiet. But there is something else, Anselm said, eyes still on the flame, a truth I have not yet told you. Thomas looked up. Anselm continued. Every monk who's held the quill has paid a cost. Thomas's fingers curled around the cloth. What cost? Not one of coin, Anselm said, but of silence, of solitude. The quill teaches you to listen, to history, to meaning, to the quiet voice behind all words. But it also calls you away from noise, from vanity, from the world outside these walls. He turned to Thomas, his gaze calm but serious. It is a lonely gift. It asks more than it gives, and it gives nothing you can keep. Thomas sat still, the fire casting golden lines across his face. But is it worth it? Anselm smiled gently. Only you can decide. Later that night, Thomas returned to the scriptorium alone. The Silver Quill remained wrapped, resting. He did not open it. Instead, he approached the page he had written that morning. By candlelight, he examined his own letters. They were not perfect, but they were true. At the bottom of the page, he picked up his iron quill and added a small line. Not for others, but for himself. Let this ink be honest, even if it is not beautiful. He placed the quill back in its cup and left the candle burning a little longer than he should have. It began as a whisper, the wind. At first, it curled gently through the hills, brushing the tops of cedar trees and weaving cool fingers through the monastery's stone corridors. The bells above the chapel swayed faintly, their chimes soft, accidental. Brother Anselm sat in the scriptorium, listening, not to the wind itself, but to the spaces it touched. The air was shifting. The stillness held a different kind of breath, a warning. He closed the manuscript gently, set aside the quill, and rose. Outside, clouds gathered like ink stains bleeding into parchment. Grey upon grey, deeper and deeper. The hills disappeared into the mist, as if the world itself were folding into memory. In the corridor, he passed Brother Thomas, who held a bundle of cloth and pigment jars, his eyes wide. "Master," Thomas said, "the roof near the dormitory is leaking. The winds pulled free the shutters." Anselm nodded once. "We need to move the texts." Thomas blinked. "All of them?" "All we can carry." Within the hour, the scriptorium transformed from a haven of slow grace to a flurry of quiet urgency. Monks wrapped codices in linen. Parchments were layered between oiled boards to keep out damp. The illuminator's tools were packed with reverence. Brushes, pigment bowls, knives for trimming vellum edges. No one raised their voice. The urgency here was not panic, but devotion. Each page was a soul. Each book a candle against darkness. Thomas and Anselm worked side by side, lifting volumes from the lower shelves and laying them on cloth-covered trays. Rain began, not gently. It slammed against the arched windows like a siege of ghostly hands. The monastery groaned under the weight of wind and water. Thunder rumbled through the earth as if the stones themselves were shuddering awake. And then, a terrible crack from above. One of the oaks that leaned too close to the wall had split. The sound rolled through the monastery like a bell of dread. Brother Thomas looked to Anselm, the West Library. Anselm was already moving. The West Wing held the monastery's oldest texts, some not even bound, only stitched in silk cords, laid gently in wooden drawers. The floor there had always been less sound, and when they entered, their worst fears were confirmed. Water was already flowing in through the broken frame of a high stained glass window, washing across the tiled floor. The corner shelf, the one containing Lucian's early works, was soaked. Thomas gasped. Anselm rushed forward, dropping to his knees and lifting one of the books. Too late. The ink bled. Lapis pigment streaked down the page like a tear. "Here!" Thomas called. "These are still dry." Together they worked in swift silence, rescuing what could be saved, binding pages in linen and carrying them to the sanctuary, one by one, word by word, until only a single volume remained. It was wedged behind the base of the altar, long untouched. The cover was caked in dust, but dry. Thomas opened it. The pages were blank. He frowned, but Anselm took it gently from him, turning to the first page. There, written in an old, slanted Latin script, was a single line: "Begin when the world forgets." They brought it with them, wrapped in 2 layers of cloth. By the time the storm eased, hours later, perhaps longer, the monks were exhausted, wet, chilled. But the fire in the refectory had been kept alive, and bowls of hot broth were passed around in silence. Anselm sat with the rescued manuscripts at his feet, drying them one by one with linen. Beside him, Thomas held the strange book. "It's empty," he whispered. "Aside from that one line." Anselm reached into his robe and took out a small glass vial. It was ink, faintly glowing, blue-black with a shimmer like night sky. "Not all books arrive full," he said. "Some wait for the hand that will complete them." Thomas looked at him and suddenly understood. Later that evening, when the rain had reduced to a whisper and the clouds thinned into gentle swaths of violet, Thomas sat in the scriptorium once more. Before him, the blank book, the silver quill in his hand. He dipped it into the ink, steadied his breath, and wrote, "On this night, as the storm howled like an ancient grief, we held the words close. We carried them not as burden, but as light." And beneath it, in smaller script, "May this book serve not as memory, but as promise." The storm had passed. Its final sighs were still caught in the hollows of the stonework, echoing in low moans through the cloisters. The sky above the monastery wore a faded gold, streaked with bruised lavender, the quiet afterglow of turmoil. On the ground, rain pooled in the garden's flagstones like forgotten mirrors. But in the scriptorium, calm had returned completely. The manuscripts had been returned to their places. The parchments, dried. The pigments, checked and sealed. The silver quill, polished and resting in its cloth cradle. Brother Anselm stood before a shelf near the west wall, one rarely touched, for it held works deemed historical rather than sacred. A strange designation, he thought. For what was history but the scripture of time? His fingers trailed across cracked leather spines, stopping at a volume bound in dark, oil-cured goatskin. No title, no mark on its spine, only the indentation of a long-vanished clasp. He pulled it free, and with it, a thin slip of parchment fluttered from between its pages. It landed on the floor with a whisper. Anselm bent slowly to retrieve it. The parchment was narrow and thin, softer than most, almost translucent. Faint markings curled along its surface like threads of smoke. He brought it to the window, turned it, waited, and then, there it was. A line, faint and silvery, began to glow, not from ink, from something else. Moonlight touched it just right, and the hidden script emerged. "Seek the page that is not written, but measured." A pause. Then below, a mark shaped like an hourglass, encircled in ivy. Anselm frowned slightly. He had seen this before. Years ago, he stepped quickly to the center table and opened the codex Thomas had helped save during the storm, the one wrapped behind the altar, thought to be blank. He turned its pages slowly, each still unmarred, until, near the middle, he found it. A leaf of parchment thicker than the others, more rigid. At first glance, not inked, but pressed into the vellum, a shallow map, lines like tracks, a symbol, the hourglass, drawn within a square. Anselm touched it with reverence and understood. "Brother Thomas," he called softly. From across the room, the young monk looked up from his copying. "Yes? Come here, please." Together, they bent over the mysterious page. Thomas squinted. "There's no writing. Not in ink," Anselm said, "only in time." He tilted the book, letting the sunlight fall across the parchment. Thomas gasped. Lines appeared, almost sculpted, into the fibers. A pattern. An invisible architecture. "What is it?" he whispered. "A layout," Anselm said. "A page designed to guide the hand, but not yet filled." "An unfinished illumination?" "No," he replied. "A riddle. A message without words." He placed the hourglass-marked parchment beside the book. They were meant to be seen together. Thomas stared, eyes wide. "But what does it mean?" Anselm was quiet. Then he smiled softly. "It means we are not the first to find silence in the margins." That evening, they brought the two together under candlelight. Using soft charcoal dust, Thomas lightly brushed across the surface of the indented page. Slowly, shapes emerged. Not letters, illustrations, a tree, an eye, an inkpot spilling upward, and in its spill, a quill, drawn not as an object, but as a path. Each curve of the quill feathered into winding routes, like a map, until they ended in a circle. Inside the circle, one word. Vivet. Thomas looked to Anselm. "It's Latin," Anselm murmured. "It means, it shall live." "I think this is a guide left by someone who once carried the Silver Quill. A message, perhaps a legacy." Thomas nodded slowly. "But why leave it hidden?" Anselm's eyes narrowed in thought. "Because it wasn't meant for just anyone. It was meant for someone who already knew how to look." He closed the book carefully. "You did well to see." Thomas flushed slightly. "You're the one who found it." "But you listened." He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "And the quill listens in return." That night, Thomas copied the hourglass symbol in his personal journal, using faint silver pigment, not as decoration, as a promise. In the weeks that followed, they continued their work, side by side, mentor and apprentice, ink and silence. Yet always, the symbol returned. In carvings, in faded margins, in strange motifs barely noticeable. The hourglass watched them. Or perhaps waited. Anselm often stood before the old shelf again, running his fingers over bindings. And in those moments, he felt it. The knowledge that even centuries of devotion could leave trails still waiting to be read. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills in a blaze of honeyed gold, Thomas approached Anselm with a new page. "I've finished it," he said. "The first page of the book we saved." Anselm looked down. There, in elegant script, still slightly shaky but honest, were Thomas's own words, bordered by winding vines of ivy and pale moths painted in moon-white pigment. At the bottom corner, nearly hidden, the silver outline of an hourglass. Anselm nodded, eyes soft. "It lives," he said. And the page did. The wind had changed again. It wasn't the kind that shook shutters or carried the scent of rain. No, this wind moved slowly, quietly, through the hollows of the monastery, curling through cloisters, sifting through corridors like a sigh remembered. Brother Thomas felt it in the scriptorium before he heard a word. The silence was too complete. Where there had always been the soft scratch of the silver quill, there was nothing. He turned to look. Brother Anselm's desk sat untouched, the inkwell capped, the silver quill remained wrapped in its cloth, and the cushion where the old monk sat each morning was empty. Thomas rose without a sound. Anselm lay in his chamber, his breathing light and even, but thin, like the last flickers of a tapering flame. The healer had already come. "There is no pain," he had said, "merely rest. He may yet wake for a time." Thomas sat beside the low cot. He did not speak. Instead, he placed the silver quill, wrapped in clean linen, on the small table beside Anselm, beside a bowl of lavender water and the last manuscript the old monk had touched. It was open to an unfinished page. A single phrase, written in silver. "May light find you in the quiet." Thomas read it again and again. The days passed in hush. Monks came and went from the scriptorium, carrying out tasks with more reverence than usual. Voices fell lower, footsteps softened. Even the bells seemed to ring with a kind of restraint, as if they too knew that something rare was nearing its close. And through it all, Thomas worked, not in the center of the scriptorium, but beside Anselm's desk. By candlelight, he prepared parchment, mixed ink, set gold leaf to rest between vellum folds. But he was not writing scripture. He was preparing a page unlike any he had done before, a page for Brother Anselm. He began with the border, not grand nor overly ornate, just ivy, winding and curling gently, drawn in delicate lines of pale green pigment. Within the vines, he nestled small details Anselm would recognize. The feather of a pigeon, a moth's wing, the spiral of the whetstone used for sharpening the quill. At the base of the page, he drew a low hill wrapped in mist. Atop it, the silhouette of a monastery, and beside the monastery, the faint outline of two figures, one old, one young, standing together beside a window. He paused only once, then took up the silver quill and wrote. Here wrote a quiet man. His ink was silence, his page eternity. Beneath it, in tiny script, he added, Brother Anselm of the Silver Quill, who remembered the forgotten, who carried light in his hands. He laid down the quill and waited. That evening, Anselm awoke, not with a start, but with the faintest flutter of his fingers. Thomas was beside him. He leaned forward. "Master?" he whispered. Anselm's eyes opened slowly, pale, clouded with age, but seeing. Thomas reached into his robe and withdrew the finished page. He laid it gently upon Anselm's chest. The old monk blinked. A faint smile ghosted his lips. His fingers touched the edge of the parchment. Then the quill. He whispered, "It lives." That night, Anselm passed. No sound, no struggle, just a slow exhale, as if finishing a final line. They buried him in the crypt beneath the scriptorium, beside the niche of Brother Lucian. His page was rolled carefully and placed inside a glass tube at the head of his stone. The silver quill remained behind. It rested once more in the scriptorium, waiting. The next morning, Thomas lit the candle beside Anselm's desk, not out of grief, but tradition. He unwrapped the silver quill and set it down gently, then opened a fresh parchment and began a new page. In the hills, where fog walks like a monk, a scribe once wrote with silver fire, and though he has gone, the flame remains. He paused and smiled. The seasons turned. In the hills, the fog came earlier now, rolling in just after sunset, curling like smoke through the monastery's narrow paths. The lavender in the cloister garden had withered into brown, brittle stems, but even in their stillness, they gave off a faint perfume when brushed by a robe or hand. Within the scriptorium, Brother Thomas worked in silence. He was no longer the youngest monk, nor the most uncertain. The silver quill still lay in its cloth cradle when not in use, resting between tasks like a sword in its scabbard. And though Thomas rarely lifted it now for more than a few lines a day, when he did, it still breathed. The other monks had come to call him Custos Lucis, Keeper of the Light. He did not encourage it, but he did not deny it either, because he understood now what Anselm had always known, that writing was not about being seen, it was about seeing clearly, and helping others do the same. On the final folio of the blank book they had saved, the one found behind the altar, Thomas had written only one sentence in the Silver Quill, just one, in letters as fine as breath. Nothing true is ever truly gone. He wrote it on the evening of the first snowfall, when the world outside turned pale and still, and the night pressed gently against the windows like a cat seeking warmth. The stars were too large, and the sun seemed to slide away to left behind it. The stars were too large, and the sun seemed to slide away to left behind it. The stars were too large, and the sun seemed to slide away to left behind it. The stars were too large, and the sun seemed to slide away to left behind it. The stars were too large, and the sun seemed to slide away to that sentence, alone on the page, glowed in the candlelight like a quiet promise. Then he closed the book and placed it on the highest shelf in the scriptorium. Not to hide it, but to wait. It was 3 years later when the boy arrived. Barefoot, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to his forehead. He had come up the winding path through the fog, stumbling, exhausted, with nothing but a sack tied at the waist and a thin blanket over his shoulders. The brothers welcomed him without question, as they always did, and when he was warm, fed, and dry, he asked, between spoonfuls of lentil stew, "Is it true about the scribe who wrote with silver?" Thomas, now bearded and lined around the eyes, looked across the table. "Who told you such a thing?" The boy hesitated. "No one," he said. I dreamed it. I saw it. A candle, a feather, a page glowing like stars." A pause. "And then I followed the mist." That night, Thomas entered the scriptorium alone. He sat at the long oak desk once more, pulled out the cloth bundle, unwrapped the silver quill. He held it for a long time, then set it on a clean parchment. The next morning he would show the boy the ink, the blade, the stone for sharpening. He would not speak of light or silence or sacrifice just yet. Those were things learned by the hand, not the ear. But he would begin, and in that the quill would live again. Centuries passed. The monastery changed hands, then changed names. It weathered war, reformation, neglect, rediscovery. The walls were restored, the bell tower rebuilt, electricity was installed, then removed again by purists, then returned, discreetly. But the scriptorium, it never fell. Even now it remains. Tourists sometimes visit, walking softly over the creaking floorboards, drawn by a strange peace they cannot name. In a small glass case at the rear, beneath dim lighting, lies a single silver quill. Its nib is worn thin, its feather pale. Beside it, a line written on aged parchment reads, "This quill wrote not only words, but time." A curator passes by. She does not speak, but sometimes, if no one is looking, she opens the hidden drawer beneath the display. Inside is a copy of a book, unpublished, hand-bound. His title simple, "The Scribe of the Silver Quill." No author is listed, only a small sigil pressed into the leather spine. An hourglass, encircled in ivy. Soft now, let your eyes close. The candle has burned low, the page is complete and still. The quill waits. The end.